The moon hung low over the quiet countryside, its pale light slipping through the cracks of Diep's wooden window. She had just finished washing the last dish when she heard soft footsteps outside, hesitant, almost unsure. Before she could open the door, James appeared in the doorway, exhausted, dust clinging to his clothes, shadows deep beneath his eyes. "James?" she whispered, her voice trembling as though afraid he might disappear like the wind. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped forward, gently but urgently taking her hand with both of his. His palms were cold, his fingers slightly shaking. "Diep." His voice cracked, something she had rarely heard from him. A man who once stood like a mountain, unshaken by storms, now struggled even to breathe steadily. "What happened? You look—" But he shook his head. "No. Let me say this first." She felt his grip tighten, and for the first time, Diep realized how heavy his fear must be. Fear not of danger, but of losing something far more precious, her. "The night before tomorrow's confrontation, I can't shake the thought that something might go wrong," he confessed. "Everything is closing in. The threats, the secrets, the lies my father built, the things I had to uncover, and if I fail, will you leave me?" The words struck her like a blade, sharp, unexpected, cruel only because they came from the man she loved. Diep stared at him, stunned. James had always been the protector, the one shielding her from the world. But tonight, he stood in front of her like a broken shield, dented, scraped, but still holding on. "James," she breathed, lifting his face with trembling fingers. "Why would you even say that?" He looked at her with eyes that carried too many nights without sleep and too many battles fought alone. "Because the people after me, they don't really want to hurt me, Diep. They want to hurt you. And tomorrow, when I confront everything, my father, the truth, the men who followed me here, I'm scared I won't be able to protect you anymore." Diep's heart clenched. All this time, she had been worrying about his silence, his disappearance, the danger surrounding him. And yet, he was the one fearing her departure. "James," she whispered, stepping closer, her forehead resting against his chest. "I didn't choose you because life would be easy. I chose you because no matter how dark it gets, you're worth it." His breath escaped in a trembling sigh, as if her words were the first warmth he had felt in days. The night wrapped around them, heavy with fear, yet strangely gentle, as though holding its breath for what tomorrow would bring. But Diep held his hand tightly, refusing to let go, no matter how uncertain the dawn might be. The wind picked up as the night deepened, brushing against the windows of the small guest house where James had insisted Diep stay. After their fragile moment, his trembling question, her gentle promise, Diep thought he would finally rest. But James did not sleep. Long after she drifted off, he stood alone on the balcony, staring into the darkness as though it held the answers he desperately needed. The city lights glimmered below like distant stars, but his mind was far away, entangled in threats, betrayal, and the storm waiting for him at dawn. Tuan had sent him a message earlier that evening. "John is moving faster than we thought. Tomorrow won't be a negotiation, it will be a trap." That sentence echoed in his head until it carved a hollow space in his chest. The confrontation he had been preparing for, collecting evidence, recording confessions, tracing years of corruption, was no longer just a business battle. It had become personal, deadly even. And Diep, she was the only thing he could lose that truly terrified him. He clenched the railing, knuckles white. "If I fail, will you leave me?" He had asked her out of fear, not doubt. Yet now her answer pulsed softly in his mind, like a heartbeat. No, I'll stay. Behind him, the door creaked. Diep appeared, wearing his oversized jacket, her hair tousled from sleep. "James, you're trembling," she whispered. He forced a smile, but she saw through it instantly. "You don't have to pretend with me," she said, stepping closer. "Not tonight." He exhaled, long and shaky, as though releasing years of carefully hidden exhaustion. She reached for his hand, and he didn't pull away. "John isn't just trying to destroy the company," James murmured. "He wants to destroy everything attached to my name, and tomorrow I might walk into something I can't walk out of." Diep didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned her head against his shoulder. "Then let me walk with you," she said. Her words were simple, but they cracked something open inside him, something he had locked away since childhood, since learning that survival meant shutting everyone out. For the first time in years, James allowed himself to be vulnerable. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her as though she were the last safe place in a collapsing world. And in that fragile embrace, under the weight of a coming war, he whispered, barely audible, "Then tomorrow, I won't be afraid." Because now, he wasn't fighting alone. Dawn crept in quietly, painting soft gold across the guesthouse walls. For a moment, the world looked peaceful, too peaceful for the storm James carried inside. He had barely slept, though Diep's presence beside him kept his mind from spiraling into darker places. When he rose from the bed, Diep opened her eyes immediately, as if she had been awake the whole time, listening for the slightest shift in his breathing. "You're leaving already?" she asked, her voice still gentle with sleep. "I have to," James replied, fastening the buttons on his shirt with slow, deliberate movements. "Tuan is waiting. We need to set the trap before John makes his move." Diep sat up, watching him with a mixture of worry and determination. "James, promise me one thing." He paused. "Whatever happens today, don't face it with the belief that you're alone. You're not." Those words echoed through him like a steady heartbeat. He walked back to her, cupping her cheeks with both hands, memorizing the steadiness in her eyes. "I know," he whispered. "You gave me strength last night, more than you realize." Tuan arrived moments later, knocking urgently at the door. "Boss, it's time," he said, eyes flicking nervously toward Diep. "John's men are already moving." James turned to Diep once more. She rose to her feet, smoothing his collar as though preparing him for battle. "Come back to me," she said. "I will." He kissed her forehead, then followed Tuan out. Diep stood in the doorway, watching them disappear into the morning light, the feeling of dread twisting in her chest like a tightening knot. The drive to the abandoned factory, the agreed meeting point, was silent except for the hum of the engine. Tuan laid out the plan, camera set, police informed, evidence ready. Once John admits he manipulated the hydropower funds, the officers will intervene. We just need him to say it. But James knew John well enough to understand. A man blinded by vengeance didn't follow scripts. When they arrived, the factory grounds were already crawling with John's men, dressed in plain clothes, pretending not to watch. The air was sharp with tension. John emerged from the shadows, smirking. "James," he greeted, "ready to lose everything?" James stepped forward, calm but unyielding. "I'm not the one who's going to lose today." What John didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that the phone in James's pocket was already recording, and today the truth would finally be dragged into the light. The wind cut sharply across the empty factory yard as James faced John, the tension between them coiling like a stretched wire ready to snap. Tuan remained several steps behind, pretending to check equipment while discreetly signaling to the hidden officers waiting for the right moment. John paced slowly, hands clasped behind his back, eyes burning with old hatred. "You know," he began, voice low and venomous, "I could have destroyed you last night. My men were already in position." James kept his expression steady, though the words hit him with icy clarity. "Then why didn't you?" "Because," he hissed, leaning forward, "I wanted you awake when you lost the person you love. I wanted you conscious when the last thing you cared about was taken from you, just like my family lost everything because of yours." Diep. Her name crashed through James' mind like thunder. His pulse spiked, but he forced his voice to remain calm. "You stay away from her." John laughed, a warped, bitter sound. "Oh, I see. She's your weakness. That sweet little girl from the countryside, so loyal, so naive. It must terrify you, knowing her life hangs on your mistakes?" James clenched his fists, struggling to keep the rage contained. But it wasn't anger that consumed him. It was fear. Fear that John had already planned something. Fear that Diep was in danger right now. "You don't get to touch her," he said through his teeth. "This ends today." John raised a brow. "Does it? Because all it takes is one word from me and she disappears. Forever." That was the slip, the admission they needed. Tuan immediately pressed the hidden signal. In an instant, officers poured out from behind crates and broken pillars, guns raised, voices commanding John's men to surrender. Chaos erupted, shouting, scrambling, the sound of boots striking concrete. John spun toward James, fury erupting in his eyes. "You tricked me!" James didn't flinch. "You destroyed yourself." Two officers seized John, forcing him to the ground while he screamed curses and threats. "You think she's safe? You think this is over?" he roared. But for the first time, James felt the crushing weight lifting. Justice was finally moving. As officers dragged John away, James exhaled slowly, his entire body trembling, not from fear, but from the overwhelming need to see Diep, to make sure she was unharmed, to tell her he had made it back, just as he promised. He took out his phone, hands still shaking, and called her. "Diep," he whispered when she answered. "It's over. I'm coming home." In the quiet aftermath of every storm, there comes a moment when the heart finally understands what the struggle was trying to teach. The story of James and Diep is not just a tale of danger, betrayal, and sacrifice. It is a reminder of the truths we often ignore until life forces us to face them. First, it teaches that love is not proven in peaceful days, but in the darkest hours. When James asked Diep, "If I fail, will you leave me?" he was not doubting her affection. He was revealing the fear carried by those who have lost too much. And Diep, by choosing to stay, showed that loyalty is not a grand gesture. It is a small, steady decision made every day, especially when everything seems to fall apart. Their bond reminds us that real love does not demand perfection. It simply asks for honesty and courage. Second, the story highlights the painful truth that family wounds shape us more deeply than any external enemy.
James became cold not because he wanted to push people away, but because the betrayal of his own father taught him that trusting others meant risking heartbreak. But healing began the moment he dared to confide in Diep. This teaches us that opening up is not a sign of weakness, rather it is the start of liberation. Silence may protect the heart for a while, but connection is what ultimately heals it. Third, the confrontation with John shows that evil often grows from pain, and unresolved hatred can consume a lifetime. John's choices were wrong, but his anger was born from injustice. The story teaches that understanding the root of someone's darkness doesn't mean excusing their actions. It means acknowledging that hurt, when left unaddressed, becomes a chain passed from one generation to the next. Breaking that chain is an act of courage. Finally, James's survival and his return to Diep show that hope exists even when all escape routes seem to disappear. Life will bring moments where the world feels too heavy, where every path looks blocked and every decision feels like a risk. But miracles often happen not through luck, but through persistence, bravery, and the belief that we are not walking alone. In the end, the greatest lesson is simple. Love protects, truth frees, and courage transforms. And when the heart chooses these things, even the deepest shadows cannot keep two people apart.